They removed me from the board of directors in front of every employee. My son's new wife stood up and coldly declared that I no longer belonged in the modern era of leadership. I sat there frozen. It felt like 20 years of devotion were erased with a single nod. Every gaze turned away, including my son's. But what they didn't know was I still held something no one expected, something quietly waiting to come to light. I walked into that boardroom like I had for years. Same seat, same smile, same folder of notes I always brought to these quarterly meetings. Routine. Familiar. I didn't expect applause or flowers, just acknowledgement. But the minute I stepped in, something was off. The energy shifted. My name wasn't on the agenda. My chair at the end of the table where I had sat for over a decade was pulled back, replaced with a single folding chair near the corner. No one said a word. Julian, my son, sat at the head of the table like always. But he didn't meet my eyes. His hands were clasped tight in front of him. Marina, his wife, stood behind him, dressed sharp in a navy blazer and heels too tall for this room. She gave me a smile so calm it made my stomach turn. It was the smile of someone about to do something cruel, but politely. Before I could even ask where I was supposed to sit, she cleared her throat, loud enough to take the air out of the room. Then she stepped forward and said it. "We've been reviewing the direction of the company and believe it's time for a new era. Denise has served this organization with heart, but leadership must evolve. Today we officially thank her for her service and announce her transition out of her current role." Just like that. No vote, no prior conversation, no mention of the 17 years I spent helping build that training center from the ground up. I opened my mouth, but no words came. My heart beat loud in my ears. I turned to Julian. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. His silence hit harder than any speech Marina could have given. There's a kind of pain that doesn't show on the outside. It stays in your throat like a stone you can't swallow. I felt that sitting there in that folding chair with eyes around the table, darting down at their notes or fake checking their phones. No one made eye contact. No one offered a hand or a word. I had become invisible in a place I helped build. And Marina, she kept talking about modern vision, about data-driven results, about rebranding the center for a younger, fresher audience. I didn't hear most of it. My pulse was too loud. My face was burning. But I sat still. I nodded. And when the meeting ended, I walked out quietly. No one followed. Have you ever felt the air change like that? Like the very walls forget you existed? That day, I didn't just lose a position. I lost the illusion that I mattered to the people I thought I raised. I lost the comfort of being needed. But more than that, I began to see something clearer than I ever had before. They might have erased my name from the boardroom, but they didn't know what I still carried with me. Not yet. I called Julian on the drive home. It went to voicemail. I waited an hour, then called again. This time he texted back. "Mama, please let Marina handle it. You've done enough. Just enjoy your time now." I stared at that message for a long while. Not a call. Not even his voice. Just a few typed words that felt like a locked door. And it wasn't just the words. It was the weight behind them. "You've done enough," like I was a project completed, boxed up and filed away. Like motherhood sacrifice, years of building and mentoring could be wrapped up with a polite dismissal and a suggestion to rest. I drove past the office. I shouldn't have, but habit took me there. My spot in the lot was taken. The familiar hum of the hangar, once comforting, felt distant. I parked across the street. Just watched. I don't know what I was hoping for. Maybe to see Julian step out, realize I was there, come talk to me. But he didn't. The doors stayed shut. lights on activity buzzing, without me. The next morning, I walked to the building like I had hundreds of times. My access badge didn't work. I tried again slower this time. Same red light, same beep. I stood there, shoulders stiff, pretending like I was just waiting for someone inside. But I wasn't. I was locked out. Inside, behind the glass, I saw familiar faces passing in the hallway. A few glanced toward me, recognized me, then looked away just as fast. Nobody opened the door. Back at home, I walked into my small office. I had framed the first blueprint of the training center on the wall. There was still a yellowed sticky note from Julian at age 12 that said, "You're the best mum. Don't let the boys boss you around." I pulled the frame down. I opened the drawer where I kept everything: certificates, meeting notes, evaluation reports, newspaper clippings from the early days when people cared. I touched each paper like it might turn to dust. The air felt thin. Then I saw the family photo, the one from the 5th-year anniversary gala. I remembered that night. I wore navy blue. Julian had his first tailored suit. Marina had just joined us back then, standing at the edge of the photo, half smiling, holding a glass of champagne. I turned the frame over. Someone had scribbled over my face in marker. Black ink, sloppy and deliberate. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a child's doodle. It was a message. The next few days passed quiet. My phone didn't ring. The board didn't contact me. No explanation, no paper trail, no meeting minutes, just silence and absence. Like I had been swallowed whole by a version of the story they rewrote without me. But I wasn't confused, not anymore. Marina wasn't just trying to restructure. She was trying to erase. And Julian, my son. He wasn't confused either. He was complicit. Maybe not in the actions, but in the silence, in the way he let it all happen and decided not to see it. I made coffee the next morning without turning the lights on, sat at the kitchen table in my robe staring out the window. And that's when it started sinking in. They didn't just take away my title. They wanted to take away my memory, my name, my place, my trace. And that was going to be a lot harder than locking a door. The message from Rosa came late in the evening. It was short, just one sentence. They turned me away, said the class was full, but I saw 5 empty chairs. I read it 3 times. Rosa had always been one of the most dedicated students I ever taught. She wasn't flashy, but she showed up early, stayed late, asked questions most of the instructors didn't have answers for. She earned every flight hour. So when she said she'd been denied entry into the refresher course, I knew something wasn't adding up. I called her the next morning. She sounded disappointed, but not surprised. They said they were focusing on younger candidates now, she told me. They didn't even look at my logbook. I thanked her quietly, then hung up and opened my laptop. I still had access to a few shared documents through my old email. Most were stripped down or archived, but a few older folders remained. The spring semester class roster was still visible. 18 students listed. I scanned the names. Some were familiar, but 8 of them rang no bells. No notes next to them. No photo ID tags. No history of previous sessions. I copied the list and began cross-referencing it with our past attendance records. One name popped up with a matching ID from a class 3 years ago, but the address was blank. Another name had no flight log attached, no emergency contact, no enrollment date. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like placeholders. My breath slowed as I read further. I dug through old printouts, scanned ID records I still had saved in my cabinet. Then I called Rosa back. Do any of these names sound familiar to you? I read off 5. She paused. No. Never met them. And I was in that class every week. I closed the file, sat in silence. 17 names total on the new list, but only 9 seemed legitimate. 8 were empty, hollow, created for what I wasn't sure yet. But I had my suspicions. I started searching addresses. One led to a closed-down P.O. box in El Cajon, another linked to an empty parcel of land outside Bakersfield. One came back as a motel that had been shut down since 2018. I wasn't looking at student records. I was looking at ghosts. I pulled out the quarterly budget I'd printed last month. Line item Federal Training Support. COVID grant. Amount $13,800 per student, multiplied by 17. $234,600. I sat with that number for a while. My training center had received emergency funding during the pandemic to support returning flight students. I remembered applying for it myself. Marina hadn't even known about the grant until I walked her through the process. I remember handing her the paperwork, explaining what needed to be reported and why every name had to be verifiable. Now somehow there were names that didn't match any record I ever created. And the funding. It was already approved, already paid. There were only 2 people with access to federal grant submissions. Myself. And Marina. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted there to be some clerical error. But there wasn't. I remembered the day she asked me to stop handling finances, told me I had earned my rest, that her background in startups would modernize everything. She had started replacing the accounting team within 2 months, outsourced to a third-party firm in Phoenix. New software, new systems. I wasn't even given the logins. And now the books were clean. The records tight, and the faces in the classroom didn't exist. Something was very wrong. And the worst part wasn't just that the fraud was happening. It was that it was happening in a place I built with my own hands. And now my name was nowhere near it. ChatGPT, Danoi. The invitation came in a white envelope with gold trim, no return address. Just my name in a font I didn't recognize. Inside was a printed card for the 10-year anniversary gala of the center. Formal attire, guest list enclosed. I read it twice. My name wasn't on the speakers list, not even listed under special recognition. I had founded the center. I'd been there the day the keys were handed over. I had trained the first class of students, cleaned the first break room, painted the hangar walls myself when we couldn't afford contractors. And now I was nothing more than a guest, one of many. But I went. I wore a deep charcoal dress with silver beading, the same one I'd worn the night Julian graduated from university. I arrived early, walked past the valet, gave my name. The girl at the check-in table looked confused, then checked a second list. Finally, she waved me in. No name tag. Inside, the space had changed. There were uplights, a floral wall with the new logo, a cocktail bar in the hangar where we used to stack toolkits. A pianist played near the stage. The banner above read in large block letters, "Celebrating a decade of modern flight training." No mention of history, no mention of founders, no archive photos on display, no nod to the past. Marina stood at the center of it all. Blue silk dress hair pinned tight, glass in hand. People circled her like satellites. She was glowing. Julian stood beside her, stiff in his tux, smiling as if everything were just right. When she took the stage, the crowd quieted. She spoke about innovation, about scaling growth, about adapting to modern markets. She praised the new model, thanked the investors, and closed with a phrase that felt like a slap. We are here because we dared to let go of outdated ideas, and because we had the courage to build forward. The room applauded. I stood near the back wall, unnoticed. My photo wasn't in the slideshow. My name wasn't spoken. The programs on every seat listed board members and contributors. My name wasn't there either. I slipped out before dessert. Outside, the evening had cooled. I walked along the edge of the building around toward the old maintenance shed. The lock was new, digital, the window painted over. I remembered when we stored spare propellers in there, when Julian scraped his knuckles trying to repair the landing gear of the old trainer plane, when Marina brought store-bought cookies during her first visit, wrapped in too much cellophane. I kept walking, to the back gate near the employee parking lot. The wall where we used to post training schedules now held a sleek monitor. The old bench I sat on to review logs was gone. It was like someone had gone through the whole place and scrubbed every fingerprint I had left behind. And they had done it quietly. Not with force. With revision. With bright colours and modern slogans. With new fonts and new people and a silence that said she was never really here. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just felt a kind of hollow that didn't echo. A quiet that settled in the chest. That night I didn't sleep much. I pulled out the first mock-up plans I drew 10 years ago. The handwritten budget, the outline for our first program. My notes in the margins still faded from the sun. I laid them out across the table and looked at what used to be. Marina wasn't just replacing me. She was rewriting me. And Julian was letting her. I unlocked the garage early that morning. The light from the side window cut across the dust in long, still beams. I hadn't been in there for a while. Most of the old boxes hadn't been touched since before Marina stepped into our lives. But I knew exactly what I was looking for. Under a sheet behind the spare tire compressor sat 2 large storage bins. I opened the first one. It held a stack of laminated training maps, some of them hand-marked with revisions from our early years. The second bin was heavier. Inside I found the archive binders. Black vinyl, labelled with masking tape and written in my own handwriting. Year 1, Year 2, Year 3. I carried them to the kitchen table one by one. By the time the sun hit the back deck, I had built a small tower of proof. Proof that I had been there. That the centre had started with more than just a dream. It had started with systems. With sweat. With money from my pension and a loan I signed alone because no one else believed in the idea back then. I opened the first binder. The original registration forms. The earliest student rosters with real signatures. Meeting minutes written in shorthand. I had typed them up at night in my pajamas while Julian was still in school. Then came the funding applications. My notes in the margins about every phone call with state licensing boards, scans of checks, receipts, handwritten memos. I turned each page slowly. Nothing had been accidental. Everything had been deliberate, documented, lived. I pulled out one document that made me stop. It was the original incorporation form. My name, bold and centered, listed as founder and director. The legal signature. The notarized stamp. None of that was in the current online version of the company's records. Marina had scrubbed it clean. Later that day, I drove to the local storage facility. I still kept one small unit, mostly for personal keepsakes and backups. Inside a locked drawer was a flash drive. I had used it to back up every financial report from the first 6 years. At the time, I thought it was just good practice. Now it felt like something more. I took it home and plugged it in. The folders opened like I'd left them yesterday. Balance sheets, P&L statements, copies of tax filings, and tucked deep in a folder marked Old Grants. I found the original federal relief request for the aviation re-entry program. My name was on the submission. I had listed specific guidelines for documentation. Marina had used that template. But what she submitted later on had diverged completely. No sign of vetting, no matching student logs. This was evidence. It wasn't just about pride anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about facts. And the facts had been erased. I walked back to the garage after dinner, found the framed mission statement we had once hung in the front lobby. I flipped it over. It still had Julian's name signed under mine. He had been proud of it once. I set it down and looked at the empty space in the garage. Everything they had erased still lived in these boxes, in these signatures, in these files. I didn't know what I was going to do next. Not yet. But I knew I wasn't going to sit in the dark while someone else rewrote my story. I had too much evidence, too much history, and finally enough distance to see it for what it was. This wasn't loss. It was attempted erasure. And I wasn't going to disappear that easily. It started with the names. 17 students listed in the last quarter's grant submission. 8 of those names had no prior history, no flight hours, no contact logs. I knew it wasn't just sloppy paperwork, it was design. I printed the list and laid it beside the enrollment records I had from the previous year. I highlighted the duplicates, the outliers, the names that came out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Then I mapped addresses. 2 led to closed businesses, 1 to an abandoned trailer lot, another to a mail forwarding company with no physical location. All of them were linked to Marina's grant reports. Not one of them matched an actual living, breathing student who had ever walked through the doors of the center. I called Rosa again. She confirmed the same thing I suspected. Her class had empty seats. Her instructor had made a comment about adjusting the books. No one thought much of it then. That night I printed everything. Every file. Every list. Every discrepancy. I made 2 copies. One I stored in a secure folder at home. The other I set aside. I wasn't sure who I would give it to yet, but I knew that day would come. In the following days, I started reviewing federal filing protocols. Quietly, carefully. I didn't want to leave a trace. I contacted Michael Rosenthal. He used to be one of our brightest students. Now he worked with FAA compliance. I asked if he could spare some time. I didn't say why. We met at a cafe in La Mesa, off the main strip. We sat outside. He ordered black coffee, no sugar. I handed him a manila envelope. He flipped through the first few pages, then stopped. How far back does this go? I told him what I knew, what I'd seen, what I suspected. He didn't say much after that, just nodded. Told me he would follow up in a week. I walked out feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. When I got home, I opened one last box from the garage. Inside was a file labeled Founding Documents. It had the original mission statement, the licensing certificates, and a photograph from the groundbreaking ceremony. I had a shovel in my hand, wearing jeans and a wide grin. Julian stood next to me. He looked proud. The kind of proud that doesn't fake itself. That version of him was long gone now. I turned the photo over. There was a date written in pen. March 18th, 2013. I wrote that myself. A small detail. But it reminded me that I had once believed in permanence. Now I understood better. They weren't just cutting me out of operations. They were planting false roots, new records, new names, rewritten timelines. They wanted a version of the center that started with Marina. A timeline that began only after I stepped away. They wanted the story to sound sleeker, younger, easier to pitch to new investors. But real stories have texture, and truth leaves traces. The flight logs, the grants, the photos, the names on the walls that had quietly disappeared. I remembered them all. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel erased. I felt ready. Michael called me a few days later. His voice was steady, low, almost careful. He said he had reviewed everything. He didn't need to ask me more questions. He had already started pulling older filings from Marina's previous ventures. Patterns were showing up. Names recycled across different institutions. Grant applications with identical structures. numbers that looked clean but didn't line up under scrutiny. Then he asked if I could meet him again this time, not at a cafe. We met in a private office space rented by a third-party compliance group that occasionally worked with FAA investigations. The room was plain. One long table, two chairs, a printer humming in the corner. He placed a folder on the table in front of me. 3 training centers, he said. All received the same federal aid within a 6-month window. All tied to Marina's name. All with identical discrepancies. I flipped through the reports. Some of the student names from my list showed up in those reports too. Same names, same birth dates, different addresses, different cities, none of them real. It wasn't just my center. She had done this before. Michael kept talking. Quietly, calmly, he had flagged the data with FAA's internal fraud division. They were reviewing everything now. He couldn't promise how fast it would move, but the evidence was already in motion. He also advised me not to confront Marina directly. Not yet. Let the process work. That night I sat in my kitchen with the lights off, just listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Everything felt still, but something had shifted. This wasn't a private betrayal anymore. It had a trail, and it was being followed. The next day, I returned to my garage. I pulled out the file with the earliest registration forms and checked the signatures again, just to be sure. Then I opened a separate envelope I had tucked away years ago. Inside was a letter from a local newspaper editor who once covered our launch. He had written that our story was one of resilience, that the training center was proof that late beginnings could be just as strong. I folded it again slowly and slid it back where it belonged. Later that afternoon, I called Rosa. I told her I couldn't say much, but that she had been right to tell me about what happened, that her words started something. She didn't need to know the rest just yet. She paused, then said she had already withdrawn from the center, said it didn't feel right anymore. I thanked her, and that was enough. A week passed, then another. I heard nothing more from Julian, not even a message. He had gone quiet again, like he always did when things got uncomfortable. But silence didn't mean absence. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, I stood at my front window and watched as a black sedan pulled up across the street. 2 people got out wearing dark jackets. They didn't approach the door. They walked toward the side entrance of the center's administrative office across the lot, the one Marina had started using for donor meetings. They stayed inside for almost an hour. Then they left. They didn't knock on my door. They didn't say my name, but I didn't need them to. Something had begun, and for the first time I wasn't the only one paying attention. I leased the hangar space without telling anyone. It was an old unit on the west side of the county airfield. Dusty, forgotten, but solid. I had flown out of that strip back in the early days, long before our center had its own runway access. The rent wasn't cheap, but I had savings. And I needed a place that was mine, not just to store boxes and memories, but to rebuild something real. I made a few calls, one to a retired instructor I trusted, another to a mechanic who owed me a favor, then Rosa. I didn't tell her everything, just that I was organizing a series of introductory flight sessions, focused on women over 60, women who had never had the chance, or women who had been told, like I had been once, that they were too late. She agreed to help before I even finished the sentence. We cleared out the hangar first, bought folding chairs, a portable projector, a second-hand coffee machine. Rosa built a basic flyer. I reached out to a few community groups, local libraries, even a couple of churches. Quietly, nothing flashy, just word of mouth and quiet hands passing it along. The first morning I wasn't sure anyone would show. By 10 o'clock there were 12 women sitting in a semicircle in that hangar, all holding clipboards. One wore a scarf, printed with little airplanes. One had brought her granddaughter. One sat alone, silent but wide-eyed. I started with stories, not about grants or scandals, just about what it felt like the first time my feet left the ground, how the world shifted under me, how I had once been scared to speak into a radio, then later trained others to do it in 3 languages. Then Rosa took over. She ran through the basics: lift, thrust, drag, what to expect in the cockpit, what to listen for. She had grown into her voice since I last saw her teach. Her confidence was quiet but solid, like it had roots. We scheduled follow-ups, designed 3-week workshops, nothing certified, just experience, just proof that courage didn't come with age limits. Each week more showed up. Word travelled. We had to borrow folding chairs from the next hangar. A bakery down the street donated pastries on Saturdays. One retired pilot offered to let us use her old Cessna for practice. I paid for the fuel. Every penny was worth it. No banners, no logos, no digital walls with my name erased. Just women who had been told they were too late and now felt the engine start beneath them. In that space, I found air again. I stopped checking the centre's website. I stopped waiting for Julian to call. My focus shifted from what had been taken to what was being built again. From the silence, something new had grown. And it wasn't fragile. It had weight, community, movement. The hangar smelled like fuel and paper and black coffee. The whiteboard was streaked with ink. We kept extra blankets for early morning sessions. And in the corner sat a stack of printouts about basic aviation safety, with my handwriting still in the margins. One afternoon, after the last group left, Rosa and I stood by the open doors looking out over the strip. She didn't say much, just placed her hand gently on my shoulder. I didn't need a title, I didn't need a board seat. I had this, and this was real. The invitation came through a formal letter this time. Embossed seal, FAA letterhead. Inside it read like routine acknowledgement, but I understood what it meant. They were hosting a regional aviation innovation summit, and the center had been invited to present. Not just attend, present. The slot was reserved for Marina. I wasn't surprised. The center still had a respectable reputation, at least on the surface. The fraud investigation hadn't gone public yet. Michael had warned me that timing mattered, that things had to move by the book. But now it seemed the book was about to be opened. I didn't need a formal invitation to attend. My name was still on the list of original founders submitted to FAA when we first applied for grant certifications. I registered quietly. No fanfare. Just a confirmation email and a badge that would be ready at check-in. I wore navy, clean, pressed, understated. I left the name tag blank. I arrived early and sat in the 4th row near the center aisle, close enough to see far enough to remain unseen. The room filled slowly. Industry folks, investors, regional coordinators, mostly suits and ties. A few familiar faces I hadn't seen in years. None of them noticed me. Or maybe they did and chose not to. Marina walked in right before the program began. She wore white, bright pristine with her hair pinned into a tight twist. Julian followed behind her carrying a laptop. He looked tired, thinner than before, not quite at ease. When Marina took the stage, her confidence was intact. She greeted the crowd with poise, spoke of numbers, growth. Her voice held authority, the kind that had been trained for rooms like this. She advanced slide after slide, filled with bar charts, projections, retention stats. Then came the part that changed the air. A slide labeled Community Integration and Support Metrics appeared on screen. It listed student enrollment increases and referenced outreach programs. Names of training modules, partner schools, support numbers. One number in bold, 17 students supported under the Federal Aviation Access Grant. My pulse slowed. Michael had told me what to expect, but seeing it live, projected 20 feet wide on a conference wall, stirred something deeper. That number was a lie, a big one, and it was the kind that came with consequences. Two figures stood quietly near the tech table. Dark jackets, no logos, no badges. One of them raised a hand slightly. The moderator stepped forward. He announced a brief delay due to a clarification request from FAA compliance. Marina blinked, smiled, looked confused, but nodded. Then the screen changed. A new slide appeared. Not hers. It had the FAA seal and the heading Review of Discrepant Data Sources in Regional Grant Use. A quiet moved through the room like a slow wave. On the screen were names, the same ghost names I had uncovered, then addresses, matching reports from 3 different institutions, all linked by application metadata. At the bottom, in smaller text, a note. Records presented by Ms. Trask are currently under federal review. Marina stood frozen, one hand still on the podium. Julian looked at her. His face dropped. No one spoke. The silence stretched. Then someone in the back stood up and walked out. A pause. Then murmurs. Then movement. The moderator returned, thanked Marina, and ended the session early. I stayed in my seat, just long enough to feel my hands steady. I hadn't spoken, hadn't raised my voice, hadn't needed to. The truth in the end had a louder tone than I ever could. The press release came out the next morning. It was short. Just a few paragraphs on the FAA site, then syndicated across small aviation outlets. The wording was clinical. An internal review had flagged inconsistencies in multiple grant applications linked to regional training centres. One centre had been suspended from new funding pending further investigation. No names, no accusations, just facts. But everyone in that conference room knew. By noon, 2 of Marina's board members had stepped down. A third posted a vague message online about transparency and leadership. The donors pulled out quietly. A scheduled media interview with Julian was cancelled. The centre's homepage went offline for an hour, then came back stripped of press kits and partner logos. Michael sent me a single line via text. It had started. That was all he wrote. I spent the afternoon at the hangar. Rosa was reviewing flight checklists with a new group. Someone brought muffins. Another woman, 68, said she hadn't held a pencil since high school, but had just completed her first taxi run. I stood near the back wall, hands in my pockets, watching them. This was what we were supposed to be doing from the beginning. Julian came to my house that evening. I saw his car pull up and stayed in the kitchen. I didn't move until he rang the bell twice. When I opened the door, he looked smaller, like something inside him had folded in on itself. His shirt was wrinkled. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there. He started to speak, but I raised my hand. I told him I didn't want apologies. Not now. Not the practiced kind. What I wanted was space. He had made his choices, not just last week or last month, but years ago. Every time he said nothing, every time he looked away, every time Marina erased something and he let it happen. He nodded, said he understood, then asked if I was coming back. I told him no. The centre wasn't mine anymore, not the building, not the title, not the name. It had been reshaped into something else, something I couldn't walk back into without losing myself again. I said I hoped he found a way through what was coming, but it wouldn't be with my name beside his. He left quietly. That night I opened the back closet and pulled out the last of the boxes. Inside were thank you notes from students, photos of early classes, a newspaper clipping from when the centre first broke even. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat with it for a while. Later, I burned the copies of the fake grant names. I didn't need them anymore. The truth was out. It had already moved beyond me, and I didn't want to hold on to the rot. The next morning, I arrived at the hangar early. The sky was soft grey. Rosa was already there, setting up chairs. I brought a new thermos of coffee and a fresh packet of safety handouts. A woman I hadn't seen before walked in, said she had heard about us through her sister. She had never flown, never even been near a runway, but she had always wanted to. Her voice cracked a little when she said it. I handed her a clipboard. This was my space now. Not polished, not perfect, but honest. And that was enough. I got the call 2 weeks later, not from Julian, not from the board. It came from a former instructor I hadn't spoken to in months. He told me the centre had shut down its weekend sessions indefinitely. Half the staff had resigned. Marina was under official audit. Some of the records had been sealed. Investors had started asking questions that no one could answer. He said it quietly, like it still didn't feel real. I thanked him, hung up, and then sat with the stillness that followed. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated, just clear. A few days later, a community group in Oceanside reached out. They had heard about the Skylight sessions through a former student, asked if I would consider expanding, said their seniors program had grant access and space for light training. They offered a partnership. I told them I'd think about it. I took a walk that evening. The air was crisp, but not cold. The clouds were low, soft-edged. I walked without direction past the old corner bakery, past the hardware store with its faded awning. When I passed the bookstore, I paused. They had changed the front display. In the window was a framed quote on a card that read, "Sometimes you don't go back because what you built doesn't need you anymore. And sometimes you don't go back because it was never really yours to begin with." I stood there for a while. The next morning, I drafted a short statement for the Skylight bulletin board. I wrote that I would no longer be attending any public forums related to the centre, that my energy was committed elsewhere. I signed it Denise Laroche with no titles after my name. Just that. Rosa read it and didn't ask anything. She nodded and posted it at the back near the coffee machine. That afternoon, we held a session with 14 women. One of them, 74, had just completed her first full taxi and was smiling so wide you'd think she'd won a medal. Maybe she had. I left a little early that day, went home and opened the old drawer where I used to keep centre materials. I cleared it out. Not with anger, just with intention. I packed the items into a small box, labelled it in black marker, and slid it onto the top shelf of the hall closet. That night, I didn't dream about the old boardroom. I didn't replay Marina's voice. I didn't see Julian's face. I slept through until morning. And when I woke up, I made breakfast slowly, put on the radio, let the light fill the kitchen, no rush, no weight on my chest, just a kind of soft space where the tension used to be. I didn't need the centre to collapse for me to feel whole. I had already made peace. I wasn't going back, because the version of me who needed their approval no longer existed. The recognition came quietly. A letter folded neatly in a plain envelope bearing the FAA seal. Inside, a short message acknowledged the impact of the Skylight sessions and honoured them as an outstanding example of community-centred aviation education. There would be no formal ceremony, just a note of thanks and a mention in the quarterly report. I read it twice, then placed it in the drawer with the rest of my quiet victories. That weekend, Rosa organised a small gathering at the hangar. Nothing extravagant, just coffee cookies and stories shared over folding chairs and laughter that echoed off the metal walls. A few of the women brought their grandkids. One even baked a cake shaped like a propeller. No speeches, no spotlight, just joy. When they asked me to say something, I kept it simple. I told them that courage doesn't arrive all at once, that sometimes it shows up in whispers, in the way we stand back up after being told to sit down, in the way we claim space without asking permission, and in the way we keep building even when someone else tries to erase the blueprint. Later that evening, I walked alone to the edge of the runway. The sun was setting behind the hills, throwing streaks of gold across the tarmac. I stood there quietly watching the shadows stretch long beside me. There was no applause, no cameras, no headlines, but I saw myself clearly, and for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough. If you've ever felt pushed out of your own life, if someone made you believe you were no longer relevant, I hope this story reminds you that true worth doesn't need to shout. As long as you haven't given up on yourself, no one can erase you. If this touched something in you, leave a word. I'll read every line.